Hi, my name is Judy,
And my name is Kai.
and in this presentation, we will be focusing on the negative impacts of the Green Revolution on the human population and environment in South Asia.
We will also touch on the impacts of the Green Revolution on food production and trade. First, we will take a look at some of the very important vocabulary terms you need to know. HYV or high yielding variety crops are essentially crops that have been specifically selected by farmers for showing certain desirable traits. Some of these traits include high yield per area or producing more food in a smaller amount of space, early maturation or being able to grow faster, resistiveness to disease, and overall higher quality of yield. The picture on the right shows a high yielding variety crop known as IR8. We will go more into this particular crop on the next slide. The next term is irrigation, which refers to the process of artificial, aka human done, moving and applying controlled amounts of water to specific pieces of land to help with the production of crops. This image of crops being irrigated with water from an external water source via pipeline. On to the next term, yield refers to the measure of grains or seed which is made from a specific area of land, usually per hectare or acre. Here on the right, you can see an example of what less yield versus higher yield looks like.
Okay, so here's the next vocabulary slide. The first term we'll be discussing here is IR8. Now, as we mentioned earlier, IR8 is a high-yielding variety of rice that's long pioneered other types of HYVs. IR8 was revolutionary as it nearly doubled the yield of rice being produced at that time. And as you can imagine, that went on to serve hungry populations all around Asia. Now, this is just an image of what IR8 looks like, and you can clearly see in the background here how there seems to be dense vegetation. This implies the high yields that IR8 produces. Subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is done to serve only a farmer and their family and is not enough to yield a profit. This image may help you to remember this: a mother and a child seemingly picking crops solely to sustain themselves. Unlike subsistence farming, cash crops are produced in an intensive farming style. Cash crops, like the name might imply, are crops that are sold for commercial purposes with the goal of making profit. Cotton, pictured here, is just one example of a cash crop.
On to the last vocabulary slide. Here, the first term is pesticides. Pesticides are basically chemical substances that exterminate pests like insects from crops to prevent them from harming plants. As you can see in the image right here is a photo of a person spraying pesticides on these plants to stop anything from destroying them. Moving forward, the next term, fertilizer. Fertilizer can either be a chemical or natural substance whose purpose is to create more nutrient-rich soil for the crops and ultimately help them grow faster. The image here shows an example of chemical fertilizer. The last term is runoff. Runoff is essentially any chemical substance like pesticides or fertilizer that seeps into the ground or contaminates streams of water and makes its way to a larger body of water.
Now, to talk more about the Green Revolution itself. To put it simply, the Green Revolution was characterized by the use of new forms of biotechnology to create disease-resistant, fast-growing hybrid seeds, particularly of staple crops such as rice and wheat. Although seemingly positive changes at first, these disease-resistant, fast-growing hybrid seeds actually require the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which went on to have grave effects on the human population in terms of prevalence of disease and broadening already existent financial disparities, as well as the environment in terms of preservation of resources and protection of wildlife.
Next is the why of where. The Green Revolution made its greatest impacts in three major regions of the world: South America, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Each of these regions was facing unprecedented levels of malnourishment and poverty because the supply of crops just wasn't keeping up with the demand of the ever-growing population. The Green Revolution provided a great solution to these humanitarian issues due to the increased yield of crops like wheat and rice. Now, although all these regions may have been impacted in a similar way, for the purpose of this project, we will be mainly focusing on South Asia.
The next section here is just some interesting data we found from the International Food Policy Research Institute that concerns food production as a result of the Green Revolution. It reads, cereal production in Asia virtually doubled between 1970 and 1995 from 313 to 650 million tons per year. Although the population increased by 60%, the increase in food production was sufficient that instead of widespread famine, cereal and calorie availability per person increased by nearly 30%, and wheat and rice became cheaper. This data is just expanding upon our original point that a lot of the famine and malnutrition plaguing underdeveloped countries was largely solved by the technologies produced during the Green Revolution.
However, although the Green Revolution proved to solve many of the food crises that plagued South Asia at the time, it went on to have many negative consequences on the human population as well as the environment. On the map to the right shows some of the regions of India where the Green Revolution made its greatest impact. As you can see, these regions all seem to be on the easternmost coast, which happen to be some of the most impoverished regions of India.
So here are just some graphs showing how the Green Revolution impacted the production of certain crops over several decades. In the first and second graphs, we see how as time progressed, yields of rice, wheat, and corn all increased, almost exponentially. In the third graph, we see how as these yields increased, the need for importation from other countries also decreased. In other words, when countries began specializing and efficiently producing these quintessential crops for themselves, their reliance on other countries went down. This shift proved to be a successful one for underdeveloped countries like South Asia, which were in dire need of economic independence after British occupation.
On to the 8th slide. There are four notable negative impacts of the Green Revolution on the environment in South Asia. One, irrigation greatly depleted groundwater. When you draw water from the ground in mass amounts at a rate where it cannot be replenished, there's no doubt why this begins happening. Second, fertilizers, pesticides, and other chemicals can contaminate runoff and pollute the ground and water nearby, like we have mentioned so many times now. When chemicals like these seep through the soil and get washed away in streams and draining rainwater, they end up in larger bodies of water and can then go on and cause plethora of problems for both the aquatic life and human populations. Third, the overuse of chemicals depleted nutrients within the soil, making it infertile and ultimately unfit for crops to grow. Lastly, there are several other unintended consequences of the Green Revolution on water use, soil degradation, and chemical runoff, especially in areas beyond the farmland itself. So these are some interesting graphs that show the crossover between pesticide use and disease. As you can see, pesticides use peak around the 1990s in the first graph. Then the second graph, we can see how diarrheal diseases in children also peak around the same time. In other words, when children begin to drink the water that has been contaminated by pesticide runoff, there is a direct correlation with illness. Now, this is a diagram illustrating the pesticide cycle. It shows how the pesticides can leak from soil on farmland into the groundwater, contaminate runoff, and produce toxic rainfall, eventually poisoning water streams, aquatic life, and human populations.
Now moving on to the negative impacts on the human population. Similar to Kai's slide, there are also 4 notable impacts here. 1. Poor farmers in poor countries could not afford the machinery needed to efficiently plant, tend to, or cultivate crops. This put them at a significant disadvantage, especially when it came to competition with farmers who could afford such machinery. Second, we have farmers in poor countries who could not afford the fertilizers needed to grow the new high-yield variety crops. Unsurprisingly, chemical fertilizers were absolutely fundamental in the Green Revolution because they helped increase yields and the rate of maturation. Without this new technology, poor farmers simply could not compete with the other farmers who could afford them. Third, people have gotten seriously ill from the overuse of chemicals. Now, this almost perfectly aligns with the environmental impacts of the Green Revolution. With the improper use of chemicals comes excess runoff, which ends up contaminating sources of drinking water, when people drink from these contaminated water sources, they can develop serious illnesses, often even being severely poisoned. This is illustrated by the 2 bar graphs here on the right. Lastly, large populations were still starving, especially in impoverished areas where, as I mentioned, there was limited access to new agricultural technologies. On this slide, we just have a personal account of a farmer experiencing some of the issues we have mentioned. So this is Ronnie, a rural Indian farmer who has recently been diagnosed with cancer. She isn't the only one though. Since 2001, about 40 people in her community of 3,000 have died of cancer. This trend of serious and terminal illness was virtually non-existent in her community up until that year. It can be reasonably assumed that this sudden spike in cancer cases occurred as a result of the overuse and misuse of chemicals introduced that year. You know, I think it's easy to overlook the human aspect of dense topics like these, and having a face to associate with the whole tragedy sort of brings it all into perspective. You all of a sudden realize that this is a real issue affecting real people in real time.
Now, on to the next topic, looking at the impacts of the Green Revolution on South Asia at different scales. First, let's look at a local scale. In many cases, rural farmers in India's impoverished villages don't know proper usage and disposal techniques, with few using protective clothing or equipment when handling highly toxic chemicals. In farming villages, pesticide containers are sometimes reused as kitchen containers, and many farmers assume that applying more pesticides and herbicides is better without understanding that the heavy use of gradual poisoning water supplies. The Green Revolution hardly seems to have made such an impact in terms of well-being in rural Punjabi villages. Rural poverty abounds, malarial mosquitoes breed in stagnant pools of water, and block carts far outnumber motorcycle vehicles. Now let's look at a national scale. Now, one of the Green Revolution's biggest area of impact is Asia as a whole, as the heavy reliance on irrigation and inorganic fertilizer has led to widespread overdraft of groundwater. Non-point source pollution and salinization of farmland across large portions of India and Pakistan.
So now that we've discussed some of the damages inflicted by the Green Revolution, it's time to propose some solutions. One solution is introducing more biodiversity into agriculture. Keeping a variety of different types of plants in one area, almost in a forest-like arrangement, will not only keep the land fertile, but will also reintroduce wildlife into otherwise deserted areas. Another solution is optimizing farming methods. In laboratories around the world, scientists have been researching ways to optimize farming by adjusting temperature, elevation, humidity, and other conditions. Implementing these optimized standards would ultimately lead to more efficient food production and the preservation of land. This can be illustrated in these images.
A third solution is replacing chemical fertilizers with organic fertilizers. Even when used in excess, organic fertilizers will not produce toxic runoff like chemical fertilizers do. Organic fertilizers are also safer and healthier for the soil itself. Our last solution is to begin expanding the use of GMOs. GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are typically designed to produce a higher yield of crops while also being naturally resistant to harmful pests and insects without the use of pesticides. Decreasing the use of pesticides is arguably the best way to begin to reverse the negative impacts of the Green Revolution.
In conclusion, although the Green Revolution resolved many of the problems stemming from malnourishment in the impoverished regions of South Asia, the negative impacts greatly outweigh the positive. It's time to bring about workable solutions to these looming conflicts.
Feel free to check out our sources as they are linked right here.